a man she'd never met, a proposal she never asked for, and a town that wouldn't stop watching. Evelyn Mercer had spent 3 years building a life with nothing but her own 2 hands. No help, no husband, no apologies. Then a dusty stranger walked through her shop door holding a letter from her sister, and suddenly the whole of Red Hollow had an opinion about her future. She wanted to throw him out. She almost did. But something in the way he stood there, hat in hand, not begging, not demanding, made her hesitate just long enough for everything to change. If you've ever been afraid to let someone in, this story is for you. Stay until the end and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see just how far this story has traveled. The first frost came early that year. Evelyn noticed it the way she noticed most things, practically, without sentiment. She'd woken before sunrise, pressed her palm flat against the window glass above her workbench, and felt the cold sitting on the other side like something with patience, like something that had decided to stay. She built the fire herself. She always built the fire herself. By the time the sky lightened from black to the bruised gray-purple that passed for dawn in the mountains, she was already at her table, threading a needle by lamplight. Mrs. Calloway's wedding dress, ivory silk, ordered 6 weeks ago, promised for Saturday. 2 days left. The bodice needed the final row of buttonholes along the back, 32 of them, each one small enough to make her eyes ache before noon. She worked in silence, which is how she preferred it. The town of Red Hollow was still asleep at that hour. She could hear the creek 2 streets over if she left the back window cracked, and sometimes the distant hollow sound of a logging wagon starting its climb up the ridge road before daylight. Otherwise, quiet. It was the part of the day that belonged entirely to her, and she guarded it the way she guarded most things, without drama, just firmness. Evelyn Mercer was 31 years old. She had come to Red Hollow from Boston 3 years ago with $42, a trunk of fabric, 2 good pairs of scissors, and a stubbornness that people out here seemed to mistake for strength. She didn't bother correcting them. The shop was small, 2 rooms on the ground floor of a narrow building on Cutter Street, with living quarters above, reached by a staircase that creaked on every 3rd step. The front room was for customers, a worn velvet settee, a long mirror with a crack at the bottom corner she'd never gotten around to replacing, bolts of fabric organized by color along the left wall. The back room was hers. Workbench, lamps, 2 chairs, the iron stove, and shelf after shelf of thread, buttons, ribbons, hooks, and all the small and glamorous things that turned raw cloth into something a woman would remember wearing for the rest of her life. She had built all of it herself, not metaphorically, literally. She'd installed the shelving with a borrowed hammer and nails she'd counted out 3 times to make sure she had enough. She'd sewn the curtains. She'd painted the sign above the door in her own careful lettering. Mercer's Dress Shop. Fine sewing and alterations. It wasn't Boston. It wasn't elegant, but it was hers, and that mattered more than anything else she could think of. The bell above the front door rang at 10:30. Evelyn didn't look up immediately. She was in the middle of a buttonhole, and she had a rule. She finished what she started before she moved on to the next thing. It had gotten her through worse than a customer arriving at an inconvenient moment. "I'll be right out," she called. Silence from the front room. No rustling, no response, no sound of a woman settling onto the settee to wait. Just the particular quality of stillness that meant someone was standing very still. She tied off her thread, set down the needle, and walked through the curtained doorway into the front room. The man standing by her door was not a customer. She could tell that immediately, and with complete certainty, the way you can sometimes read a room before you understand why. He was tall, not extraordinarily so, but enough that he'd have to duck under the doorframe of most places in town. He wore a canvas work coat, dark from weather rather than dye, and boots that had seen serious country. His hat was in his hands. He was holding it with both of them, turning it slightly, the way a man does when he's trying to look like he's not nervous. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that needed attention 2 days ago. His eyes, when they met hers, were steady and darker than she expected. Not cold exactly, but careful, like a man who had learned to be careful. "Miss Mercer," he said. "That's right." She didn't move from the doorway. "Shop's open, but I don't believe you're here for a dress." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. No, ma'am. Then you'd better tell me what you are here for. He reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope. It was crumpled at one corner and had clearly traveled a considerable distance. He held it out toward her with one hand, the other still working the brim of his hat. She didn't take it. Not yet. Who are you? Gideon Ashcroft, he said. I came from Missouri, before that further. He paused. The letter is from your sister, Clara. Evelyn felt something move through her chest. Not quite warmth, not quite alarm. Clara. She hadn't heard from Clara in 4 months, which was not unusual. Clara wrote in bursts, 3 letters in a week, and then nothing for 2 months. She was 24 and lived in the same town they'd grown up in, married to a school teacher named Henry, and she had never fully understood why Evelyn had left. Evelyn crossed the room and took the envelope. The handwriting on the front was Clara's. Loopy and slightly chaotic, letters bumping into each other in their eagerness to get somewhere. Her name, Evelyn. No address. Because the man had been meant to deliver it by hand. She broke the seal and read. It didn't take long. Clara's letters never did. She had the gift of getting directly to the point, which was one of the things Evelyn both loved and occasionally found catastrophic about her. Evie. I know you'll be angry and I know you'll say I had no right, but I'm saying it anyway because someone has to. You're alone out there, and you don't have to be. Gideon Ashcroft is a good man. I've known his family since childhood, and I trust him completely. He is looking for a place to belong. I thought maybe you both were. Just talk to him. Don't send him away before you've done that much. I love you. Clara Evelyn read it twice. Then she folded it very precisely and put it in her apron pocket and looked at the man standing in her shop. My sister, she said, keeping her voice entirely level, sent you here to marry me. She sent me here to meet you, Gideon said. What happens after that would be your decision. And yours, I'd assume. Yes, ma'am, mine too. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching, which was either a good sign or an irritating one. She hadn't decided which. Mr. Ashcroft, she said finally, I don't know what my sister told you about me. Whatever it was, I suspect it was too generous and not entirely accurate. I am 31 years old, I run a business, I have no particular interest in giving up either of those things. I wouldn't ask you to. You say that now. I mean it now, he said, and I expect I'll mean it later. Why? The word came out sharper than she intended. Why would you travel? What, 800 miles? More? For a woman you've never seen based on a letter from someone who feels guilty about her sister living alone? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't, he agreed. Except that I'd been in the same place for 3 years and I couldn't see the point of it. And Clara Ferris has always had good instincts about people. He paused. She said you had something worth traveling to find. I didn't know what that meant exactly, but I came anyway. Evelyn stared at him. I'd like to send you away, she said. I know. I'm not sure I'm going to. He didn't say anything to that. He just stood there, hat in both hands, waiting. The news was all over town by sundown. Evelyn didn't know how these things traveled so fast, whether Mrs. Pruitt at the dry goods store had seen the stranger's horse tied outside and started the thread, or whether Frank at the livery had recognized an out-of-towner and started asking questions. It didn't matter. By the time she locked the shop at 6 o'clock and climbed the stairs to her apartment above it, she could feel the particular weight of being talked about pressing on the town like weather. The next morning confirmed it. She had 3 customers before noon. None of them needed anything urgently. Margaret Hollis just happened to be passing. Caroline Webb had a question about a hem she could have asked 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Dorothy Pruitt herself came in, which was notable because Dorothy Pruitt hadn't set foot in Mercer's since a disagreement about muslin pricing the previous spring. All of them looked at her with that particular careful attention that pretended not to be attention. I heard there was a man, Margaret said, studying a bolt of blue wool that she had no intention of buying. There was, Evelyn said. She was at the counter, writing in her order book. She did not look up. A stranger. Yes. He's staying at the boarding house, they're saying. Hetty Morrison said he's looking for work at the timber camp. That's his business, Evelyn said. Margaret set down the wool. Evelyn, what's he doing here? She looked up then, because there was a version of answering that deflected and there was a version that was simply the truth, and she had always found the truth used less energy. My sister sent him, she said. She thought we might suit. I thought she was out of her mind. I'm still deciding. The silence that followed had several distinct emotions in it. Your sister, Margaret said slowly. Clara. Yes. She sent a man west to meet me. Yes. Margaret sat down on the settee. Lord, I'd prefer you not, Evelyn began. I'm not going to tell anyone who isn't going to hear it by Wednesday anyway, Margaret said, not unkindly. Evelyn, what do you think of him? It was a simple enough question. Evelyn put her pen down. He didn't try to impress me, she said after a moment. That's unusual. Is that good? I don't know yet. Gideon Ashcroft started work at Caldwell's timber camp on Tuesday, 3 days after he'd arrived. Evelyn knew this because practically everyone in Red Hollow told her. She also knew, because she had eyes and the camp was visible from the north end of Cutter Street on a clear day, that he was there before first light and still there when she locked up at evening. She didn't go out of her way to observe this. She simply noticed it the way she noticed the frost that morning, practically and without sentiment. On Friday, Frank Dubois' barn caught fire. It was late afternoon, dry and windy, and the fire moved fast. By the time the alarm went up and men started running for buckets and shovels, the north wall was fully involved. Frank had 3 horses in the paddock and couldn't get the gate open. The latch had warped in the heat before anyone could reach it. Evelyn heard about what happened next from 3 separate people before she saw it herself. Gideon Ashcroft had come down from the Ridge Road at a run, still carrying his work axe. He didn't ask who was in charge or what needed doing. He went straight to the paddock gate, read the problem in about 2 seconds, and cut through the latch with one swing. He got all 3 horses out while the gate itself was still smoking. Then he stayed until the fire was out. 6 hours through dark, hauling water from the creek with whoever else showed up. When Frank tried to thank him afterward, apparently Gideon said something like, "Don't mention it," and went to clean up. Frank Dubois told this story to Evelyn himself, on Saturday morning, standing in her doorway with his hat in hand. He didn't know me from anyone, Frank said. Didn't ask whose barn it was or whether the man deserved help. Just, he stopped, shook his head. You don't see that every day. No, Evelyn said. You don't. She saw Gideon himself that evening. She was coming back from Mrs. Calloway's, the wedding dress delivered, the final payment tucked in her coat pocket. When she nearly walked into him on the corner of Cutter and Main, he was heading toward the boarding house. He stopped when he saw her, and there was a half second where they both stood there like 2 people who have been thinking about each other and are now pretending they haven't. Miss Mercer, he said. Mr. Ashcroft. She adjusted the empty bag on her shoulder. I heard about the Dubois fire. Not much to hear, it got handled. 3 horses, she said. Frank said he cut through a hot iron latch. The axe did most of the work. She almost said, don't be modest, but she didn't, because there was a difference between modesty and simply not making things larger than they were, and she suspected he was doing the latter. You're not going to take credit for anything, are you? Something moved in his expression. Credit doesn't build much. They stood in the cooling air for a moment. Down the street, the lights were coming on in the saloon. Someone was playing piano badly. I want to ask you something, Evelyn said, and I want you to answer honestly. I'll try. What do you actually want? Not from me, from here, from this. She gestured vaguely, meaning the town, the territory, all of it. What did you come out here hoping to find? He was quiet for longer than most men would have been. She appreciated it. Permanence, he said finally. I've been moving since I was 19, following work, following weather, following whatever seemed like it might be worth following. I'm tired. He said the last 2 words simply, without self-pity. I want to build something that's still standing when I'm old. I don't have anything like that yet. A ranch, she said. Yes. That's a hard thing to build alone. I know. He didn't say that's why I'm here. He didn't have to, and she noted that he didn't. I'm not going to make any promises to you, Mr. Ashcroft, she said. I'm not asking for any. But I'm also not going to send you away. He nodded slowly, like he was turning that over, looking at it from different angles. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They parted ways at the corner, heading in opposite directions, and Evelyn walked back to her shop in the dark without hurrying, which meant she was thinking about something she didn't want to examine too closely yet. She let herself in, climbed the creaking staircase, third step, always, and stood at her bedroom window looking out at the frost-blue street below. The stranger had come 800 miles because her sister asked him to. He had stayed because, she thought, he meant what he said. He wasn't going to push. He wasn't going to ask for things. He was simply going to be there, working, building his own case in the patient way a man does when he has learned that words run cheaper than actions. It terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Not because she thought he was dangerous, because she wasn't sure she could keep pretending she didn't want to find out what permanence felt like. She pulled the curtain, went to bed. Outside, the temperature kept dropping. The frost settled in for the night like something that had decided to stay. The second week of October brought rain that couldn't make up its mind. It would start and stop, like someone unsure whether the effort was worth it. The mud on Main Street turned thick and uncooperative. The timber camp shut down for 2 days when the Ridge Road became impassable, which meant the men came into town with nothing to do and money in their pockets and varying degrees of judgment about how to spend both. Evelyn noticed Gideon during that downtime the same way she'd been noticing him for 2 weeks. Sideways, without meaning to, the way you notice a sound that isn't quite loud enough to identify, but won't stop either. He didn't come into the saloon with the other camp workers. She knew this because Margaret Hollis told her, with a certain emphasis that was clearly meant to communicate something. Instead, he spent the rain days at the boarding house helping Hetty Morrison repair the fence along her back property line, which had been leaning at a dangerous angle since spring. Hetty was 63 and had been widowed for 8 years, and she told Evelyn on Wednesday morning, coming in to have a coat relined, which absolutely could have waited, that Gideon Ashcroft had fixed 3 fence posts, restrung the wire, and refused to take a cent for it. "He ate supper with me, though," Hetty said, settling into the settee with the satisfaction of someone delivering important intelligence. "We talked for a good 2 hours." "About what?" Evelyn asked, mostly because not asking would have been stranger. "Oh, all manner of things. His family, Missouri, the different places he's worked." Hetty paused with the deliberateness of someone who has practiced this pause. "He asked about you." Evelyn kept her eyes on the coat she was measuring. "What did he ask?" "How long you'd been here. What kind of person you were." Hetty tilted her head. "I told him you were the most capable woman in Red Hollow and also the most stubborn, and that both things were equally true. That's accurate." "He laughed," Hetty said, "not meanly, like he was pleased to hear it." Evelyn set down the measuring tape. She picked it up again. She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and Hetty Morrison was old enough and sharp enough to read it perfectly. The rain let up on Thursday. The camp reopened Friday. Life in Red Hollow resumed its ordinary forward motion, and Evelyn told herself that was fine. That ordinary and forward were exactly what she needed. She didn't quite believe it, but she told herself anyway. The town's opinion of Gideon Ashcroft was shifting, and she tracked the shift the way she tracked everything, quietly and with more attention than she let on. In the first week, people had watched him the way they watched any stranger, with the specific wariness of a small town that had seen enough transient men to know that easy charm and reliable character were not the same thing. He'd been polite enough, they allowed. But polite was cheap. Then came the barn fire. Then came Hetty's fence. Then came the Tuesday afternoon when old Pete Garza's wagon wheel cracked in the middle of Main Street, blocking traffic in both directions, and Gideon, who had been walking past carrying his lunch pail from the camp, stopped, assessed the situation, went to the smithy on the next block, borrowed the tools he needed, and spent 90 minutes fixing the wheel in the mud and the cold while Pete stood there looking simultaneously grateful and embarrassed about being grateful. After that, the conversations in Evelyn's shop started to change. "He's a hard worker," Caroline Webb said, which, from Caroline, who had strict opinions about men who talked too much and worked too little, was significant. "Keeps to himself, but not in a strange way," Frank Dubois said. He'd come in to ask about a vest for his wife's birthday and stayed to talk for 20 minutes. "Not standoffish, just settled, maybe, like he's not trying to prove anything." He's not from here, Mrs. Pruitt said, in a tone that suggested this was both an observation and a category. But even Dorothy Pruitt's version of skepticism had softened slightly, which Evelyn registered. What no one said directly to her, but what lived in every paused sentence and carefully measured look, was the thing they were actually thinking. What are you going to do about him? She didn't have an answer. She was working on it, which was different. It was the second Saturday of October when Gideon came to the shop for the first time since that initial morning. She was in the back room when the bell rang, and something in her, some small, irritating instinct, knew before she walked through the curtain that it was him. She was right. He was standing in the same spot as before, hat in both hands, which she was beginning to recognize as simply how he stood when he was somewhere he wasn't sure of his welcome. Mr. Ashcroft. Miss Mercer. Sorry to interrupt. He glanced at the curtain behind her. I won't keep you. I wanted to ask if I could take you to supper. At the hotel dining room. He paused. Not as a proposal or anything that formal. Just supper. She looked at him. You know that if I walk into the hotel dining room with you, this town will have us engaged by morning. I know. And you're asking anyway. I figured you'd rather I asked directly than found some sideways way to suggest it. She considered that. He was right, actually, which was mildly annoying. She hated being anticipated. Saturday or Sunday? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, controlled, but she caught it. Either one. Sunday, she said. 6 o'clock. He nodded. 6 o'clock. He put his hat back on. Thank you, Miss Mercer. Don't thank me yet, she said. I haven't decided what I think of you. I know that too, he said, and left. She stood in the empty shop for a moment afterward, looking at the door. Then she went back to work, because the buttons on Mrs. Calloway's cousin's traveling jacket weren't going to sew themselves, and because standing around thinking about a man who had ridden 800 miles based on her sister's instincts was not a thing she had time for. She thought about it anyway, off and on, for the rest of the afternoon. Sunday came around the way Sundays do, slowly and then all at once. Evelyn spent the morning catching up on orders she'd fallen behind on during the Calloway wedding rush, ate lunch standing at the kitchen window watching the aspens losing their last yellow leaves, and told herself 3 times that supper was just supper. At 5:30, she went upstairs and changed her dress, which she also told herself meant nothing. The hotel dining room was the nicest establishment in Red Hollow, which wasn't saying a great deal. The tablecloths were white and only occasionally stained. There was a chandelier that worked on most of its candles. On Sunday evenings, it drew the better-dressed half of the town, ranchers, the doctor and his wife, the bank manager, the Methodist minister's family, and also, tonight, practically everyone Evelyn had ever sold a dress to, all of whom managed to be seated at various tables across the room when she and Gideon walked in. She felt every eye in the place move to them. Gideon, to his credit, didn't look around the room to see who was watching. He just pulled out her chair and sat across from her, and picked up his menu like a man who had decided the only people in the room worth paying attention to were at his table. You look like you're bracing for something, he said, without looking up from the menu. I live here, she said. These people know everything about me. And now they're learning everything about this situation. It's not comfortable. Do you want to leave? She thought about it honestly, which she respected herself for. No, she said. He looked up then. Good. They ordered roast beef for him, the chicken for her, and for a while the conversation stayed in safe territory. He asked about the dress shop, and she told him more than she'd intended to about the early days when she'd had almost no customers and had taken in mending at reduced rates just to keep the lights on. He listened without offering opinions she hadn't asked for, which was rarer than it should have been. Where did you learn to sew? He asked. My mother, then practice, then more practice. She turned her water glass. I wasn't particularly good at first. I ruined a considerable amount of fabric in 1878. What made you keep going? She considered the question. I didn't have anything else I was better at, she said, and I needed something that was mine, not belonging to someone's household or someone's expectations, something I'd made with my hands that I could point to and say, I did that. That exists because I existed. She heard herself say it and wondered if it sounded strange. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I understand that, he said, not expansively, just plainly. The ranch, she said. Yes? Tell me what you're thinking, specifically. She leaned forward slightly. Not the general idea. What exactly? He set his fork down and she could see him deciding how seriously to take the question. He decided correctly. There's land about 4 miles northeast of town, he said, past the Garza property, before you hit the tree line. Creek runs through the lower portion, clean water year-round. South-facing slope, good for grass early in spring. It's not cleared, most of it, but the timber's valuable, so the clearing pays for itself. He paused. I've been out there 3 times now, just to look at it. I know what the house should sit, where the barn should go. You've been planning it in your head. For a while. Does it belong to anyone? Old Harlan Webb owns it. He's not using it. Hasn't been for years. I talked to him last week. He'd sell at a fair price. He picked up his fork again. I don't have the full price yet, but I'm working on it. You talked to Harlan Webb before you even knew if you'd be staying in Red Hollow? I knew I was staying, he said simply. I just didn't know yet in what capacity. Evelyn sat back. Across the room she was aware of Margaret Hollis failing very hard to pretend she was not watching. She didn't care at the moment. Mr. Ashcroft, she said carefully, what exactly did my sister tell you about me? He seemed to think about how honest to be. She said you left Boston because your situation there didn't allow you to be yourself, that you built something real out here, but you'd closed off the parts of yourself that weren't useful for surviving alone. He paused. She said you were the best person she knew and that you deserved more than you were letting yourself have. The dining room felt suddenly smaller. Clara says things like that. She meant it. She always means it. Evelyn turned her water glass again. She's not wrong, exactly. She's just missing context. What context? She didn't answer immediately. The waiter came, refilled their water, disappeared. She could hear the quiet murmur of other conversations, the clink of silverware, someone laughing at a table near the window. I was engaged, she said, in Boston, for 14 months. He was well regarded, good family. He wanted a wife who would reflect well on him, and I was capable enough at performing that role that I didn't notice for a long time how much of myself I was putting away every day to do it. She stopped. When I finally told him I wanted to keep working after we married, I'd been sewing for 3 years by then, had a small clientele, he explained very calmly that a wife of his station didn't do that. Gideon was listening without any expression she could read. I gave him back his ring, she said, came out here with $42, cried for about 3 days and then stopped and got to work. She met his eyes. I'm telling you this so you understand what I'm protecting. It's not stubbornness for its own sake. I built this life in exchange for giving up something that hurt me, and I am not willing to lose it. I know, he said. You can't know. You've been here 3 weeks. I know what you're saying, he said, and I'm not asking you to give anything up. I wouldn't. He leaned forward slightly. I want to be clear about that. Not because it's what you want to hear. Because if you gave things up for me, I'd lose the thing that makes this worth traveling 800 miles for. The silence between them was different than it had been before. Heavier. More honest. You say that now, she said. I'll say it again in 6 months if you need me to. She studied him across the white tablecloth in the candlelight of the Red Hollow Hotel dining room with half the town quietly watching. He didn't look away. He looked, she thought, like a man who had decided on something and was not in a hurry to be talked out of it. I'm still not making any promises, she said. I remember. But I'm thinking about it less like something to dismiss and more like something to evaluate. That's all I can offer right now. That's enough, he said. They finished supper. He walked her back to Cutter Street, said good night at her door, and didn't try to extend the evening. She went upstairs and sat in the dark for a while, not ready for lamplight, not ready for the version of herself that got practical and efficient and stopped feeling things that were inconvenient. Because the inconvenient thing was this. She had spent the last 3 years being certain that the life she was building was complete. that she had arranged all the pieces correctly, that the space where someone else might have stood was not a gap, but a choice, a deliberate, reasonable, self-protective choice. And Gideon Ashcroft was making it very difficult to keep believing that, not through pressure, not through charm in the easy surface kind of way, but through the simple, relentless evidence of being a particular kind of person, steady and patient and without performance, in a town where everyone was watching to see if the performance would crack. It wasn't cracking, that was the problem. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. Gideon stayed on at the timber camp, and word came back, quote, in the way all words came back in Red Hollow, through the invisible and highly efficient network of people with something to say, that he was the best axeman Caldwell had hired in 3 years, and that he'd pulled a younger worker out from under a falling branch in October that would have broken both the boy's legs at minimum. The boy's name was Danny Pierce, 19 years old, and Danny's mother came to the dress shop not to order anything, but to tell Evelyn with wet eyes that she wanted her to know what kind of man she was considering. I'm not, Evelyn started. Everyone knows you're considering, Hazel Pierce said, not unkindly. This is a small town. We see things. She pressed Evelyn's hand briefly. He's a good man. That's all I came to say. She left before Evelyn could respond, which was perhaps intentional. The arguments inside Evelyn's own head were getting harder to maintain. She'd built them carefully over years, say, the logic was sound, the evidence was personal, the conclusion was reasonable. Depending on another person was risk. Merging her life with someone else's was risk. History had demonstrated that the person you thought you knew could reveal new expectations the moment you committed yourself. But she was watching Gideon not reveal new expectations. She was watching him show up, day after day, doing exactly what he said he would do, asking for exactly what he'd said he'd ask for, which was nothing except the chance to prove himself. It was harder to argue with evidence than with fear, and the evidence was accumulating. The 3rd week of October, he stopped by the shop on a Tuesday, not at an unusual hour, in the middle of the afternoon, with a directness she'd come to recognize as simply how he operated. He had a question. He asked it. I found out Webb will hold the land option for 30 days, he said. I want to put my name on it, before someone else looks at it. He paused. I'd like you to see it first, before I do, so you can tell me if it's completely wrong. She looked at him. You want my opinion on land you're buying? I want your opinion on whether it's a place someone would want to live, he said. I can judge the practical side of it. I'm less sure I'm seeing it right for the other parts. She understood what he meant. He wanted to know if she could picture herself there, and he was asking without asking, because asking directly would be applying pressure he'd said he wouldn't apply. Thursday, she said. I'm free Thursday afternoon. Thursday, he agreed. They rode out on Thursday, which was cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that made the mountains look closer than they were. The land was 4 miles northeast, as he'd said, and when they reached the lower edge of it, where the creek came out from between the pines and ran across a flat open stretch before bending south, Evelyn dismounted and stood still for a moment, just looking. It was not a polished piece of land. There were sections choked with brush that would take a season to clear. The slope had some rocky outcroppings that would make any foundation work interesting. The creek bank was soft and would need reinforcement, but the light came across the south-facing slope in a long, clean pour, and the view from the rise above the flat. You could see the whole valley and the darker line of Red Hollow in the distance, and beyond it the mountains wearing early snow, was the kind of view that made you understand why people came west in the first place. Well, Gideon said. He was standing a few feet behind her, giving her room. It's rough, she said. Yes. That rocky section below the rise is going to be a headache. I know. The creek bank needs work before spring, or you'll lose 20 feet of good ground to flooding. She paused. But the light is remarkable. The whole afternoon comes in from the south. And the view... She stopped. Yeah, he said quietly. The view. She turned around. He was looking at it too, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not the careful steadiness she'd come to expect, but something more open. Something that was maybe what a man looked like when he was looking at the thing he'd been trying to get to for a long time. Put your name on it, she said. He looked at her. It's a good piece of land, she said. Someone else will see that if you wait. She turned back to the view. Put your name on it. Evelyn, he said. She went still. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Thank you, he said. She didn't say don't mention it, because that would have been false. She didn't say you're welcome, because that felt inadequate. She said nothing, which was its own thing, and after a moment he came to stand beside her. Not close enough to touch, not close enough to crowd, and they both stood there looking at the valley and the mountains and the particular cold, clear light of a Thursday afternoon in October. There were things she wasn't ready to say, things she wasn't ready to feel fully, because feeling things fully was where the risk lived, and she had been managing her risk carefully for 3 years, and she was not prepared to simply stop. But standing on that rise above the creek on that piece of uncleared, imperfect land, with this man who had come 800 miles and hadn't once tried to make her into something she wasn't, she felt the walls she'd built doing something she hadn't planned for. Not falling. She wasn't ready for falling, just shifting, rearranging, making room for the possibility that she had been wrong, not about the value of the life she'd built, but about whether building it meant she had to build it alone forever. She wasn't ready to say it, but she felt it, standing there in the cold light, with the valley spread out below them like an answer to a question she hadn't finished asking yet. November came in hard. Not the slow, creeping cold of October that gave you time to prepare, but the sudden kind. The kind that dropped 15 degrees overnight and froze the mud in the street into hard-ridged furrows that caught wagon wheels and twisted ankles and put everybody in a bad temper by the first week. The mountains disappeared behind clouds that stayed for days. The timber camp cut its hours. Coal went up 2 cents a pound at Pruitt's Dry Goods. Evelyn ordered an extra hundredweight delivered to the shop and did not think about the cost until she'd already signed for it, which told her something about where her head was. She was distracted. She knew it. She resented it. She had always been good at compartmentalizing, putting things in their proper boxes, closing the lid, getting on with what needed doing. It was one of the skills she'd developed in Boston in the long engagement years, when she'd learned to put her own wants in a box and work around them. She'd kept the skill when she left because it was useful even if the original application had been wrong. The dress shop ran on her ability to focus. 32 buttonholes, one at a time. You didn't make good work by letting your mind wander. But Gideon Ashcroft was refusing to stay in the box she kept trying to put him in. He had signed the land option the Friday after their Thursday ride, which she knew because Harlan Webb mentioned it to her directly. Harlan was one of the few men in Red Hollow who spoke to Evelyn without any performance attached to the words, and he said simply that the Ashcroft boy had come in, paid the option fee in full, and shook hands like someone who'd been waiting a long time to shake that particular hand. "Good piece of land," Harlan said. "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "He said you'd seen it." Harlan looked at her in his flat, unhurried way. "Said you told him to sign." "I told him someone else would take it if he waited." "Same thing," Harlan said, and left. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. Something had shifted on that hillside. She couldn't pretend otherwise, and it showed up in small ways that she kept cataloging despite herself. The conversations with Gideon were different now, less careful. He'd taken to stopping by the shop on his way home from the camp, not every day, maybe 3 times a week, and they'd talk for 20 minutes or half an hour about things. Ordinary things. The progress on clearing the first section of his land, a problem with the east-facing wall of the future barn that he was working out on paper, whether the creek bank would hold if they built the retaining wall at an angle rather than straight. The we in that last conversation had stopped her cold for a half-second before he kept talking. He hadn't noticed, or if he had, he hadn't drawn attention to it. She'd thought about it for 2 days. The problem was not that she didn't want what he was describing. The problem was that she did, and wanting it meant risk, and risk meant the specific kind of pain she'd spent 3 years making sure she'd never feel again. That pain had been so complete, so total. The morning she'd given back the ring in Boston, stood in her fiancé's parlor with her hands perfectly steady while her entire future rearranged itself around her, that she had simply decided, without drama, that she would not put herself in the position to feel it again. She had been doing fine with that decision, right up until October, when a stranger with a battered hat and his own particular brand of patience had walked through her door. The crisis came on a Wednesday, which seemed unfair. Crises should have the decency to arrive on dramatic days. She was in the back room working on a complicated order. 3 dresses for the Hartley sisters, who were visiting from Denver and had opinions. When she heard the front bell, and then voices, more than one, and a tone that didn't belong to customers, she came through the curtain to find Margaret Hollis and Caroline Webb standing in the middle of her front room wearing identical expressions of people who have come with information they feel obligated to deliver. "What?" Evelyn said. Margaret and Caroline exchanged the look of 2 women who have discussed in advance who's going to speak first. Margaret lost. "There's talk," Caroline said. "There's always talk." "Specific talk," Caroline pressed her lips together. "About Mr. Ashcroft, and about what people think the situation is between the 2 of you." Evelyn waited. "Some people are saying it's not proper," Margaret said, "that he comes by the shop, that you had supper at the hotel, that you rode out alone together to look at land." She stopped. "Dorothy Pruitt was talking at the Ladies' Aid meeting yesterday. She said a woman running a business can't afford to have her reputation." "Dorothy Pruitt can find someone else's life to manage," Evelyn said. "That's what I said," Caroline murmured. "But she's not the only one saying it," Margaret said, and her voice was different now, careful, with the weight of something she genuinely didn't want to have to say. "There are people who think that if there's no formal understanding between you and Mr. Ashcroft, then the situation looks a certain way, and that if there is a formal understanding, you should say so and stop making people wonder." The silence in the shop was long and uncomfortable. "What people are really saying," Evelyn said finally, and she heard her own voice come out very flat, "is that a woman who makes her own choices about her own time is subject to other people's approval of those choices." "That's not wrong," Margaret said. "It's also not going away. I'm aware." She turned back toward the curtain. "I appreciate you telling me, both of you." They left. She stood at the workbench not working for 10 minutes, which was unusual. Then she picked up her needle and finished the bodice seam she'd been on, and when she locked the shop that evening, she walked to the boarding house on Elm Street for the first time since Gideon had arrived in Red Hollow. Hetty Morrison answered the door and had the grace to look unsurprised in a way that suggested she'd expected this visit for some time. Gideon came downstairs in 3 minutes. He'd clearly been in the middle of something. His hair was not entirely settled. He was pulling his collar straight as he came down the stairs. He stopped at the bottom when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing happened. I need to talk to you." They sat in Hetty's front parlor, which Hetty evacuated with impressive speed. The lamp on the table between them was turned low. Outside the window, November pushed at the glass. "The town is talking," Evelyn said, "specifically about you and me and the impropriety of the current arrangement." Gideon was still. "What do you want to do about it?" "That's what I'm here to figure out." She put her hands flat on her knees. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." "All right. Do you still want what you said you came here for?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes. Even knowing that I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not easy, Gideon. I don't mean the way people mean it when they say a woman is difficult. I mean, I have a very established way of doing things. I have a business I'm not going to give up. I have opinions about how things should run that I've spent 3 years testing and proving, and I don't change them without cause. I'm not—" She stopped again. "I'm not what people imagine when they picture a frontier wife." "I know that," he said. "That's not what I'm looking for." "What are you looking for?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Someone who's actually there," he said, "not performing being there, actually there, with her own mind and her own work and her own opinions." He paused. "I've been around enough people who are performing their life that I can tell the difference. You're not performing." "I'm scared," she said. The 2 words came out without warning, stripped of everything she usually wrapped around them. "I know that too," he said, and his voice was quieter. "You don't know why." "I know some of it. You told me at the hotel." He held her gaze. "The rest I can guess. You let someone in before and they tried to make you smaller, and now letting anyone in feels like starting something that ends that way." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Evelyn? He said her name the way he had on the hillside, but carefully, like he'd earned the right to it but wasn't taking it for granted. I can't promise you that nothing will ever go wrong between us. I'm not able to make that promise and mean it. But I can tell you what I intend. And I intend to never ask you to be less than you are. Not for me, not for this town, not for whatever people think a wife is supposed to look like. That's a large intention, she said. I know. What happens when it's tested? I hope you'll tell me when it is, he said, so I can be accountable to it. She looked at him for a long moment in the low lamplight. His expression was open in the specific way she'd noticed before. Not calculating, not performing patience, just actually there, actually waiting, not trying to fill the silence with words that would do his case more good than they'd do her reality. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. I mean that practically. I've been alone for 3 years. I've been managing everything alone for longer than that. I don't know how to let that be different. Neither do I, really, he said. I've been on my own since I was 19. He exhaled slowly. I expect we'd figure it out. Probably make some mistakes. Probably be harder on each other than we need to be sometimes. That's not exactly a romantic pitch, she said. No, he agreed, but it's honest. She almost laughed. It surprised her. The almost laugh. The sudden softening of something in her chest that had been held rigid for a very long time. She looked down at her hands on her knees and then back up at him. All right, she said. He went still. All right, what? All right, I'm going to stop arguing with myself about this. She said it like she was making a decision about a fabric order. Clearly, finally. I'm not promising a wedding. I'm not promising anything formal yet, but I'm in. I'm choosing to be in this. Whatever this is. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a word for. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more like the expression of a man who has been cold for a very long time and has just walked into a room with a fire in it. Thank you, he said. Stop thanking me for things that benefit me too, she said. It's irritating. He did laugh at that, low and real, and it was the first time she'd heard him laugh fully, and she filed it away in the part of herself that was apparently still collecting information about Gideon Ashcroft, despite the fact that she'd just told him she was done arguing with herself. She went home that night feeling lighter and more terrified in equal measure, which she suspected was probably the correct ratio. What followed was a month that Red Hollow would talk about for years, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the quality of the ordinary things that happened inside it. They were seen together, regularly, deliberately, in the way two people are seen when they've stopped hiding that they want to be seen together. The hotel dining room on Sunday evenings became a fixture. She stopped in at the Land on Thursdays when the weather allowed, and the two of them would walk the property while he explained what he was thinking and she pointed out what he was missing, which was a more equitable division of contributions than most people in town expected. She brought a notebook to those Thursday visits, started sketching, not the house itself, that was his to design, but the workshop, where it might sit relative to the house, what the light would be like at different hours, how many windows would be needed for the kind of precision work she did. Gideon watched her do this on the third Thursday without comment, and on the fourth Thursday he said, without preamble, I was thinking we put the workshop door facing east. You'd get the morning light in. She looked up from her notebook. I was going to suggest that. I know, he said. That's how I knew it was right. She looked at him for a moment, then back at her notebook. Southeast, she said. Not straight east. You want the winter sun as long as possible. He adjusted the measurement in his own notebook without argument. It was, she thought, the best conversation she'd ever had about a building that didn't exist yet. The trouble came from where it usually did. Not from Gideon, not from herself, but from the outside world, which had opinions it felt entitled to share. It was a Sunday in late November. They had just come out of the hotel after supper and were walking back along Main Street in the cold dark when a man named Carl Briggs fell into step beside them. Carl worked at the timber camp, had been there since before Gideon arrived, and had a way of talking that was shaped like friendliness but wasn't quite. Ashcroft, he said, cutting between them with the practiced ease of someone who's decided he's been waiting to do this. Hell of a thing, coming all this way to court a woman who can't decide if she wants courting. Gideon said nothing. I mean, no offense to the lady, Carl went on, which meant exactly the opposite. But a man has to wonder what he's working toward, you know? Town seems to think there's an understanding. Not sure the lady does. Carl, Gideon said. His voice was completely level. Keep walking. Just making conversation. Keep walking, Gideon said again. Same tone. No heat in it, which somehow made it more final. Carl looked at him, then at Evelyn, then back. He laughed once, short and flat, and walked on ahead. Evelyn waited until he was 20 yards away. I could have handled that. I know, Gideon said. That's why I did it first. She considered arguing the point and decided it wasn't the argument she actually wanted to have. The actual argument was inside her, and it wasn't about Carl Briggs, it was about the word he'd used. Understanding. The town thought there was one. She'd told Gideon she was in, but in what exactly? They hadn't named it. She had specifically not named it because naming it made it real in a way she could lose. And losing real things was worse than losing possible ones. She stopped walking. Gideon stopped a half step later, turned to look at her. What does the town think we are? She said. I imagine they think we're heading toward engagement. Are we? The question sat in the cold air between them. His breath fogged. Hers did too. That's up to you, he said carefully. Don't do that, she said. Don't put it entirely on me. That's not equal. That's you making yourself comfortable by making me decide. He took that without defensiveness, which she noted. You're right, he said. I'll say it then. He paused. Yes, that's what I'm heading toward. I want to marry you, not because your sister sent me here, not because I need a wife for the ranch, or because it's the next logical step, because... He stopped, seemed to find the right words. Because you're the most interesting person I've encountered in a long time, and every conversation I have with you makes me want the next one. Because watching you work is like watching someone be entirely themselves, and that's rare enough that I'd be a fool to walk away from it. She was afraid. She was still afraid. She suspected she might always be a little afraid of this, because the thing it could cost her was not nothing. But she was also, and this surprised her with its steadiness, its lack of drama, certain. She didn't say that yet. She wasn't ready to say it yet, and she was learning to trust the difference between not ready and not willing. She was willing. She just needed to say it in her own time, in her own way, which was how she did everything that mattered. Walk me home, she said. Yes, he said. They walked the rest of Cutter Street in silence, and it was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. He stopped at her door as he always did, said goodnight, started back the direction they'd come. Gideon, she said. He turned. She looked at him standing in the amber spill of the street lamp, his coat collar up against the cold, his face open and waiting without pushing. I'll know when I'm ready, she said, and when I am, I'll say so. He nodded once, slowly. I'll be here, he said. She went inside, climbed the staircase, third step, always, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark without lighting the lamp. Not because she was sad, but because she wanted to stay inside the feeling a moment longer before the practical world came back. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was large and uncertain and contained still a considerable amount of fear. But underneath the fear, steady and quiet as the creek on Gideon's land, was something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a full minute to name it. It was hope. Real hope. Not the careful, managed kind she'd allowed herself in small doses for 3 years, but the actual thing. Unguarded, inconveniently large, absolutely unwilling to be put back in its box. She sat with it in the dark for a long time. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and went to her workbench because there was still work to do, and she had never been the kind of woman who stopped working just because something important was happening. She threaded a needle, picked up the Middle Hartley sisters' dress. Outside the window, the first snow of winter began to fall over Red Hollow, slow and quiet, covering everything in white. The snow that started falling that November night didn't stop for 3 days. By the time it did, Red Hollow was buried under 14 inches of white, and the whole town had the particular suspended quality of a place that has been forced, against its will, to slow down. The timber camp shut completely. The road north became impassable until Caldwell sent men out with shovels on the fourth day. Children appeared in the street with sleds. Old Pete Garza's dog barked at the snow for 20 minutes and then gave up and went inside. Evelyn shoveled her own front step, which was a thing she always did herself, and then she went inside and made coffee and sat at her workbench and did not think about what she had decided in the dark 3 nights ago. Or rather, she thought about it the way you think about a thing you've already decided. Not examining the decision anymore, just living next to it and getting accustomed to its shape. She was ready. She had said she would know when she was ready, and she did know with the same certainty she felt when a dress was finished and right. Not perfect, there were always small imperfections, but right. Complete. The thing it was supposed to be. What she didn't know was how. She was not a woman who did things conventionally when she could do them honestly. And the conventional path, like waiting for him to ask, receiving the question gracefully, accepting with appropriate emotion, felt wrong in a way she could not ignore. Not because there was anything wrong with it in the abstract, but because it put her in a position she'd already lived in, already left, and had no intention of returning to. Waiting to be asked was waiting for permission, and she was done with that. She was going to ask him. The idea settled in with the snow and stayed. She didn't act on it immediately. Not because she was losing her nerve, she had checked on her nerve twice and found it present, but because she was practical enough to know that proposing marriage to a man required, at minimum, that the ground between you was clear enough to walk on. The snow kept her in the shop for 2 days. On the third day, she got the front step clear and the walk along Cutter Street passable. And on the fourth day, she opened the shop and resumed the ordinary business of living in a winter town with a large personal decision, sitting quietly in the corner, waiting for its moment. Gideon appeared on the 5th day, mid-morning, not long after the camp road had been declared open again. He looked like a man who had been indoors for 4 days and found it difficult. "You survived," she said, when the bell rang and she looked up from the counter. "Barely." He stopped just inside the door. The cold came in with him, and the particular smell of outside, pine and frozen air, that she had started associating with his arrivals. "Hetty plays cards. I learned every game she knows." "How did you do?" "She's ruthless," he said. "I don't recommend it." She almost smiled. "I heard the camp road's open." "Since this morning. I go back tomorrow." He looked at her. "How are you?" It was a simple question, and he asked it simply, without performance, the way he asked most things. She had been thinking for 4 days about how to say what she needed to say, and she had it organized. She had the words in a sensible order. She had intended to pick a specific moment. She looked at him, standing just inside her door in his work coat, with snow still on his boots, and the words rearranged themselves without her permission. "Close the door," she said. "Come in." He closed the door, came to the counter, waited. "I've been thinking," she said. "I can see that." "I told you I'd know when I was ready," she said, "and that when I was, I'd say so." Something shifted in his face, very small, very controlled. "Yes." "I'm ready," she said. She held his gaze, both hands flat on the counter. "I'm not waiting for you to ask me. That's not how I want to do this." She took a breath. "So I'm asking you, Gideon Ashcroft, do you want to marry me?" The shop was completely quiet. Outside, a wagon went past on the slushy street. The stove ticked. He looked at her for a moment that was probably only 5 seconds, but had the weight of considerably more. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Good." She exhaled. "Then that's settled." "That's settled," he agreed, and something in his expression broke open in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled steadiness, not the careful patience, but the real thing underneath all of it, unguarded and direct, and it was the most honest she had ever seen a person look, and it nearly undid her completely. She did not let it undo her completely. She was still herself. "I have conditions," she said. He blinked. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "Of course you do. The shop stays mine, not ours, mine. The income, the decisions, the hours. I am not your wife who sews on the side. I am a seamstress who is also your wife. That distinction matters." "Agreed." The workshop on the property gets built before the house is finished. I'm not waiting 3 seasons to have a proper place to work. He nodded slowly. We can do that. I will not be managed, she said. If you disagree with the decision I've made, you say so directly and we discuss it. You don't go around me. You don't decide things that affect me without telling me. I wouldn't, he said. You might, she said, without meaning to. It's something people do when they've been making their own decisions alone for years. I do it too. We'd have to watch for it. He studied her for a moment. You've thought about this carefully. I think about everything carefully. I know. He was quiet for a beat. Can I add one? She hadn't expected that. Go ahead. When you're scared, when something feels like it's going wrong between us and you want to close off and manage it alone, tell me instead. You don't have to handle it by yourself anymore. That's the part I want most. He said it plainly, without drama. I'm not asking you to be less independent. I'm asking you to let me be someone you can count on. Those aren't the same thing. The back of her throat ached slightly, which she attributed to the dry air from the stove. Agreed, she said. Then we have a deal, he said. We have a deal. She extended her hand across the counter. He looked at her hand, then he took it, and instead of shaking it, he just held it for a moment. Her hand in both of his, the way he held his hat when he didn't know his welcome. And then he let go and she turned back to her work before her face did something she wasn't ready for it to do. The engagement, such as it was, became public knowledge in Red Hollow before the week was out. Evelyn told Margaret Hollis on Thursday, which was equivalent to posting a notice in the window of every business on Main Street. She told her plainly, without preamble, and she reported afterward to no one that Margaret had cried, which was unexpected and also, privately, a little touching. The town's reaction was not uniform. Most people were, she would have said, cautiously pleased, which was about as good as Red Hollow got before sufficient time had passed for something to become ordinary. Hazel Pierce came back to the shop not to order anything but to squeeze both Evelyn's hands and say nothing, which said more than most conversations did. Frank Dubois shook Gideon's hand outside the hardware store for long enough that passing strangers probably thought something significant had been announced. Dorothy Pruitt said she hoped things would work out, which was Dorothy Pruitt's version of a blessing, and Evelyn chose to receive it as such. Carl Briggs said nothing, which was the best outcome available. The harder part was the letter. She sat down to write Clara on a Wednesday night in December, 3 weeks after the conversation at the counter. She'd been putting it off, not because she didn't want to tell her sister. She did, badly, in the way you want to share a thing with the person who would understand it most, but because she didn't know how to say it without also saying everything else. Without saying, you were right, and I was more defended than I knew, and I'm still working out how to be this open, and it is harder than I expected, and I am also more certain than I have been about anything in 3 years. She wrote 4 drafts. The first 3 were too composed. The 4th one was honest. Clara, you were right, and I know you will be insufferable about it, and I am writing this anyway. His name is Gideon, as you know, because you sent him. He is not what I expected. He is patient without being passive. He is kind without being soft. He asked me nothing except the chance to prove himself, and he spent 2 months doing exactly that, quietly, without expectation, which is rarer than you know. I asked him. Not the other way around. I expect you are not surprised. We are planning a spring wedding. I don't know the date yet because we haven't gotten there, and I refuse to plan things out of order. The land is 4 miles northeast of town. There is a view from the upper slope that I would like to show you someday. I owe you an apology. Not for being careful. I still think being careful was right, but for the years of letters where I told you I was fine when what I meant was that I was managing. Those are not the same thing, as someone recently pointed out to me. I have been managing for a very long time. I think I am finally trying something else. Come in spring. I want you there. Evelyn. She sealed it before she could revise it again, addressed it, set it by the door to post in the morning. Then she sat in the quiet of the upstairs kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and let herself feel the strange relief of having told the truth to someone who had known her before she became the version of herself that was entirely self-sufficient. December deepened. The construction on the land paused. Gideon was practical enough not to push foundation work into the hardest freeze, though he spent every weekend hauling timber that would become the barn framing in spring. He had bought into a temporary partnership with a rancher named Aldous Heck on the south side of town, who needed a winter hand and paid fair wages, which meant Gideon had income through the cold months, and also, unexpectedly, acquired 2 horses that Heck let him stable in exchange for extra labor. He brought her to see the horses on a Saturday in mid-December, which Evelyn recognized as the kind of small, ordinary thing that accumulated into a life. One was a buckskin gelding he'd already been working with. The other was a dark bay mare, 7 years old, steady-tempered according to Heck, with one white sock and an opinion about strangers that expressed itself through stillness rather than movement. "She's assessing me," Evelyn said, standing at the fence. "She does that with everyone." "I respect it," Evelyn said, and held out her hand and waited, and the mare came to her in her own time and allowed herself to be touched, which Gideon watched with an expression that he probably didn't know was on his face. "What?" Evelyn said, catching it. "Nothing," he said. "Just, you know how to wait for things." "I've had practice," she said. They stayed at the fence for a while, and the cold was significant, but neither of them mentioned it, and she found herself thinking about the shape of the months ahead. Spring, the foundation, the framing, the weeks of rough construction that would turn that swept-clean hillside into something habitable. It would be loud and expensive and not remotely romantic, and she was looking forward to it in the specific way she looked forward to complicated projects that would require everything she had. Christmas came and went. Red Hollow did the things small frontier towns do for Christmas. A community dinner in the meeting hall, a bonfire on the solstice that had been a tradition since before anyone could remember who'd started it, children in the street with new boots and old sleds. Evelyn closed the shop for 3 days, which she hadn't done since the previous year's blizzard. She spent Christmas Day at Hetty Morrison's table, along with Gideon and Pete Garza and the young timber worker Danny Pierce and his mother Hazel, because Hetty Morrison had the gift of assembling people who didn't have somewhere else to be and making them feel like somewhere was exactly where they were. It was not an elegant Christmas. The turkey was dry in the middle. Pete Garza told 3 stories that went on longer than their conclusions warranted. Danny Pierce ate enough for 2 grown men and was unashamed about it. Hetty ran out of gravy and then somehow produced more gravy, which remained one of the minor mysteries of the evening. Gideon sat across the table from Evelyn, and she watched him talk to Danny about the timber camp, and to Pete about horses, and to Hazel about something she couldn't hear from her end of the table, and she watched him be comfortable. Not performing comfort, actually comfortable in a room full of people who were not his family and never would be in the way of blood, but who were beginning to be his people in the way of place and time and showing up. That was what she saw, watching him. Someone learning how to stay. After dinner, when Pete and Danny and Hazel had gone, and Hetty had retired with strategic timing that Evelyn had begun to suspect was not accidental, they washed dishes together in the kitchen, Gideon washing, Evelyn drying, because there wasn't room for both of them at the basin, and it was domestic in a way she had braced herself to find strange, and instead found simply natural, normal, the right weight for the moment. "I want to tell you something," Gideon said, handing her a plate. "All right." "I didn't expect this to be like this." He paused. "I came here because Clara asked me to, and because I needed somewhere to be going. I wasn't expecting anything specific. I told myself not to." She dried the plate. "And this is more than I was expecting." He handed her another plate, kept his eyes on the basin. "You're more than I was expecting. And I know I've said versions of that before, but I mean it differently now that I know you better." He paused again. "I wanted you to know that." She set the dry plate on the stack. She thought about saying something deflecting, something practical, something that kept the conversation at the comfortable level she usually maintained. She thought about what he'd said months ago, standing at the front counter. "When you're scared, tell me instead." "I didn't expect you either," she said. "I want you to know that too. I'd gotten very good at expecting nothing, and I was fine with it, and then you came and none of my arguments worked." She set down the dish towel briefly. "That was extremely inconvenient." He laughed quietly and looked at her sideways. "I know." "I'm glad," she said. "That's all. I'm glad." He handed her the last dish. Their hands were close together on the rim of it for a moment, and she didn't move hers, and neither did he. And it was a small thing, completely ordinary, the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself, and she held it anyway because she was learning, slowly, with effort, against years of practice in the other direction, to hold the small things instead of moving past them. January arrived without ceremony. The land sat under snow, patient, holding its shape under white, while Gideon finalized plans on paper and Evelyn finalized plans in her head. And between them they had, in the course of ordinary winter days, designed the basic architecture of a life. The workshop would face southeast, as she'd said, 3 windows on the south wall, 2 on the east, a door wide enough for bolts of fabric to come through without damage, a stove, her specifications, not the standard issue, in the northeast corner so the heat moved across the room toward the work area. Space for 2 sewing tables because she was already thinking, cautiously, about the possibility of an apprentice in a few years when the business grew enough to need one. She drew it in her notebook with careful measurements. She tore out the page and gave it to Gideon on a Thursday, and he looked at it for a long moment, and then he folded it precisely and put it in his inside coat pocket, close to where it would stay until spring. "This is what you need?" he said. "That's what I need," she confirmed. "Then that's what we'll build," he said. And she believed him, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the entire winter. Not the proposal, not the plans, not the letter to Clara. The most remarkable thing was simply this. She believed him, not because she had proven him trustworthy over time, though she had, and not because she had no other choice, though it had felt that way sometimes, but because somewhere in the months between October and January, she had made the decision to believe him. And it was a decision, an active one, repeated every day. She didn't let the old fear win. Some days were easier than others. Some days the old arguments came back, sharp and familiar and dressed up in the language of self-protection, and she would sit with them for a moment, acknowledge what they were protecting, and then set them down. Not throw them away, just set them down. There was a difference. She was still afraid sometimes, and she had stopped pretending otherwise, which was its own kind of progress. The February thaw brought the first real look at the cleared lower section of the land, and Gideon took her out to see it on the first dry Saturday of the month. He'd been working weekends through January with 2 men from the camp, clearing brush and pulling stumps from the flat section where the house would go, and what was revealed underneath the cleared ground was dark, good soil that held its structure when you turned it, the kind of ground a ranch could grow from. She walked the perimeter of the cleared section, and he walked beside her, and at the south end she stopped and turned and looked back across the flat toward the slope and the view above it, and the mountains were out for the first time in weeks, white and enormous against a sky that had decided, just for today, to be entirely blue. "This fall," she said. "We'll be living here this fall." "That's the plan," he said. "It's a good plan," she said. They stood looking at what was not yet what it would become, and what had already stopped being what it was, and the particular silence of a winter field in the brief mercy of a February thaw. She reached over and took his hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. No one saw it. The mountains were not watching, and the sky with its brief blue was not invested in the outcome. She just reached over and took his hand because she wanted to, because she was not afraid of it in this moment, because 3 years of choosing everything alone had earned her the right to choose this too. He held on without making anything of it, which was exactly right. They stood there for a while longer, until the cold came back the way it always did, practical and unwilling to be ignored. And then they walked back to the horses and rode toward town, and the mountains behind them caught the late afternoon light, the way they always had, indifferent and beautiful, framing everything that was still to come. Spring in Red Hollow arrived the way most good things did, gradually, then all at once. The creek on Gideon's land ran high through March with snowmelt from the upper ridges, exactly as Evelyn had predicted, and the retaining work they'd done on the bank in late February held without drama, which was a relief but not a surprise. She had specified the angle of the stone placement herself, consulting with Pete Garza, who had ranched this valley for 30 years and knew where water wanted to go when it had a choice. Pete had looked at her diagram, suggested 2 modifications, and shaken his head in the specific way of an old man who is impressed but considers showing it unnecessary. The foundation went in the first week of April, when the ground was solid enough to work but not yet baked hard by summer. Gideon had hired 2 men from town, Reeves, who did masonry, and a younger man named Sol, who had worked construction in Denver before coming west for reasons he didn't elaborate on. Between the three of them and the occasional Saturday labor of Frank Dubois and Danny Pierce, who showed up without being asked, the foundation took 8 days. Evelyn came every evening to see the progress. She would ride out after locking the shop, survey what had been done, and give her assessment, which ranged from "that's right to the east wall needs to come up another 6 inches," or "the workshop floor won't drain properly." Reeves, who had 30 years of experience and initial reservations about taking guidance from the landowner's fiancée, revised his opinion by the end of the second week, when the grading she'd insisted on proved itself during a hard April rain that would have flooded the lower sill otherwise. "She's not wrong much," he told Gideon in the particular tone of a compliment that doesn't want to admit it is one. "No," Gideon said, "she isn't." The workshop frame went up the third week of April, ahead of the house frame, as agreed. Evelyn was there for that Saturday, not helping because it was not her kind of work and she knew her limits, but watching, which was its own thing. She stood at the edge of the cleared ground with her notebook and watched the skeleton of a room take shape against the spring sky. And she felt something she'd felt before only in the early days of the shop, when she'd looked at 4 walls that were hers and thought, "This exists because I decided it would." The difference was that this time she hadn't decided it alone. She wrote to Clara again in April, shorter this time, with more specific information. The date had been set, the last Saturday in May, which gave them 6 weeks and was, in Evelyn's assessment, sufficient time for what needed doing. She had already begun the dress, working on it in the late evenings after the shop closed, which was the only time she had to herself and also the only time she wanted to do it, because there was something right about working on it in the quiet dark after the ordinary business of the day was done. Clara's response came fast, faster than Evelyn expected. 12 days, which meant she had likely written back the same afternoon the letter arrived. "Evie, I will be there. Nothing on earth could keep me away. I am already crying, and I haven't even left yet. Henry says to tell Gideon he'd better deserve you, and I said that Gideon already knows that and is working on it daily, and Henry said that's the right answer. We will arrive the Wednesday before. Save me a place to sleep that isn't the boarding house, because Hetty Morrison will ask me questions for 3 days straight, and I will run out of answers. I love you. I am so proud of you. Not for finding him, for letting yourself find him. Those are not the same thing, and you know it." Clara Evelyn read it at the counter on a Tuesday morning. She folded it. She went to the back room and stood at the workbench for a moment with her eyes on the window and let herself feel what the letter had put in her chest, which was large and complicated and would not be managed quickly. Then she went back to work, because Mrs. Heck needed her spring blouse by Friday, and affection, however genuine, did not sow itself. Clara arrived on a Wednesday, 12 days before the wedding, on the afternoon stage from the rail junction 40 miles east. Evelyn was at the stage stop when it pulled in, not because she'd planned to be sentimental about it, but because Margaret Hollis had offered to watch the shop for the hour, and there was no reasonable excuse not to go. The stage door opened and Clara Ferris stepped down, and she was 24 and smaller than Evelyn remembered. Or maybe Evelyn had grown broader in the way women do who spend their days doing physical work. And she had Henry's old traveling bag over one shoulder and her hat slightly wrong from the journey. And she looked exactly like the person who had written "I love you" in a letter that Evelyn had read in a back room alone. They held on to each other for a moment, which was not something the Mercer sisters did often and therefore mattered more when they did. "You look different," Clara said, stepping back to look at her. "I look the same." "You look—" Clara tilted her head. "Settled? You look settled." Evelyn picked up the bag before Clara could. "Come on, you can tell me everything I missed on the walk back." What Clara told her, over the course of that Wednesday afternoon and evening in the apartment above the shop, was a year's worth of Missouri news delivered at Clara's characteristic pace, fast, overlapping, occasionally circling back to correct an earlier detail. Henry's school, the new family next door, the Ferris cousin who'd made an inexplicable business decision involving a barge. Clara talked and Evelyn made coffee and listened and laughed at the right moments and felt, for the first time in years, the specific texture of having her sister in the room. When the news ran out, Clara looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "Tell me about him." "You know him," Evelyn said. I know his family. I knew him when he was 19 and working his first season on a cattle drive and didn't say more than 30 words at our dinner table. Clara wrapped both hands around her mug. I sent him to you because I trusted what I knew then. I want to know what you know now. Evelyn considered. He does what he says, she said finally. Every time, without making a performance of it. She looked at her own coffee. He doesn't try to make me smaller, even when it would be easier. When my opinion costs him more work or money or time, he doesn't. She paused. He asked me once to tell him when I'm scared instead of managing it alone. That's the most useful thing anyone has ever asked of me. Clara was quiet for a moment. Are you happy? The question was direct the way Clara's questions always were, cutting through the layers to the actual thing. Evelyn had been asked variations of this question before, by Margaret, by Hetty, by customers who thought they were being subtle, and she'd answered all of them with some version of I'm doing well or things are going well, which were true, and also not the same as what Clara was asking. Yes, she said. I am. It's not simple, and I don't expect it to get simpler, but... She stopped. Yes. Clara nodded once slowly. Good, she said. That's all I needed. The week before the wedding was not restful. Evelyn had expected this. She had not expected quite the specific shape of the unrest, which was less anxiety about the wedding itself and more the accumulated weight of everything changing at once. The shop would remain on Cutter Street through at least the next season, she'd decided, because moving the business while also moving house was a level of disruption she refused to take on. But come autumn, when the ranch was livable enough, she would run the business from the workshop on the land. Different light, different walls, same work. She was up late most nights of that final week, finishing the dress. It was ivory, not white, which she had always found cold, but the specific warm ivory of natural silk before it gets processed into something it isn't. She'd ordered the silk from Denver 6 weeks ago and had been working on it in pieces, each section cut and sewn and set aside until she had enough to assemble. The bodice had a fitted simplicity that took more skill to achieve than ornate work did. The skirt fell clean and full, without excess. She'd embroidered the cuffs herself, small paired stitches, nothing elaborate, but in a pattern she'd designed from memory of a dress her mother had once worn that she'd always loved. On the Thursday night, 2 days before the wedding, Clara sat in the chair across from the workbench and watched her do the final pressing of the skirt. You made your own wedding dress, Clara said for the second time. Who else would make it? Someone who wasn't also the bride. I'm the best seamstress in Red Hollow, Evelyn said, without arrogance, because it was simply true. I wasn't going to put on something made by anyone else. Clara was quiet for a moment. Mama would have something to say about that. Mama would agree with me, and you know it. Clara laughed. She would, actually. Evelyn finished the pressing and hung the dress on the form in the corner of the back room and looked at it. It was, she thought, a good dress. Not perfect. There was a seam on the left back panel that was slightly tighter than she'd intended, not visible from the outside, but she knew it was there, but good. Right. The thing it was supposed to be. She thought about what she'd put into it, all those late-night hours with the lamp burning while the town slept. Hope, obviously, but not the wishful kind that has nothing underneath it, the earned kind that knows what it cost, that has looked at the alternative and chosen this instead. That was the kind of hope you could build a life on. The Saturday morning of the wedding was cold for May. Not winter cold, but the mountain spring kind that comes from clear skies and elevation. The kind that softens by noon but has opinions about early morning. Evelyn woke at 5, because she always woke at 5, and lay still for a while listening to the creak sound she'd started to hear in her mind even when she was in the shop on Cutter Street, even though the shop was nowhere near water. She was not nervous exactly. She was aware. Every sense a little higher than usual, the way you feel on the first morning of a long trip when you know the road ahead is real, but you haven't started down it yet. Clara came down from the spare room at 6 with her hair undone and a concerned expression. I didn't sleep enough. You slept fine, Evelyn said. I heard you. That was performative sleep. Clara poured coffee and leaned against the counter. How are you? I'm all right. You don't have to be all right if you're not. I know. Evelyn set down her own cup. I'm all right, Clara. Not because I'm managing, because I'm actually all right. Clara studied her for a long moment the way younger sisters study older sisters when they've spent a lifetime measuring emotional temperature. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and drank her coffee and started talking about what time they needed to leave, and the morning became the ordered, practical thing that Evelyn needed it to be. The ceremony was held outside. This had been Evelyn's choice, firmly made and not revisited. The idea of being indoors for it had felt wrong, like conducting important business in a room that didn't fit the scale of it. The land was too unfinished to hold a ceremony, the ranch not yet livable, so they'd chosen the flat ground at the south end of town, near the tree line, where there was room and where the mountains were visible in every direction, framing everything without comment. Most of Red Hollow came. She hadn't expected that, though she should have. People from the timber camp, Reeves and Soul, and Danny Pierce with his mother. Harlan Webb, who had sold the land and shaken Gideon's hand that day in his office, stood near the back with his hat against his chest. Margaret Hollis was in the front. Hetty Morrison had worn her best coat, the black one she saved for significant occasions. Frank Dubois was there, and his wife Ellen, and the Hartley sisters from Denver, who happened to still be in town and apparently considered themselves involved. Dorothy Pruitt was there, standing straight back near the middle, and when Evelyn passed her, she nodded once, with a particular expression that wasn't warm exactly, but was its own kind of acknowledgement, and Evelyn received it for what it was. Clara walked beside her to the front, because there was no one else appropriate, and because Clara was the reason any of this existed. Gideon was standing at the front in his good coat. He'd bought a proper one in March, dark wool, better cut than his canvas work coat, and he'd brushed it himself that morning until it was as good as it was going to get, which was good enough. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at the land that first Thursday afternoon, when she'd seen what a man looks like looking at the thing he's been trying to get to for a long time. Only now it was her. She held that look and didn't look away. Justice Alderman conducted the ceremony. He was an older man, methodical, who believed in getting the words right without dragging them out beyond what the moment required. He spoke about partnership and responsibility and the willingness to stand by your word in a territory that would test every promise you'd ever made. When it came to the vows, Evelyn had written her own, which surprised no one who knew her. I'm not very good at certainty, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. I've spent most of my life being careful about what I believed, so I couldn't be wrong about it, but I'm certain about this. About you. She held his gaze. I'm not promising you easy. I'm promising you honest. I'm promising you that when it's hard, I'll say so instead of disappearing behind it. I'm promising you the real version of me, not the managed one. She paused. That's the only version worth promising. Gideon's jaw moved. He held it together. His own vows were shorter, which was him. I came out here looking for somewhere to stay, he said. I found it. Not just the land. He paused. You were the part I didn't know to look for, and I intend to spend a long time being worth what you decided to risk. Clara, to her left, made a sound she was trying to suppress. When it was done and they were pronounced married under the open sky with Red Hollow spread out on all sides of them and the mountains standing their usual indifferent witness, Gideon kissed her. Brief, real, without performance, and she felt the specific quality of a thing completed. Not finished, completed. The way a dress feels when the last seam is sewn and the whole thing finally holds the shape it was always meant to be. The celebration was honest and imperfect, which suited them both. Hetty Morrison had organized food, and most of Red Hollow had contributed something, which meant there was too much of everything and several dishes that didn't obviously belong together, and it was the best meal Evelyn had eaten in a long time. Danny Pierce ate for 3 again and was again unashamed. Someone produced a fiddle. Margaret Hollis cried twice more, which set a personal record she seemed pleased about. Clara cornered Gideon for 20 minutes in the late afternoon, which Evelyn observed from a distance without concern. When it was done, Clara came back to where Evelyn was standing and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. Well, Evelyn said. He said he knew, the first week, that you were going to be hard to walk away from, Clara said. He said he's never been good at walking away from things he knows are worth staying for. Evelyn looked across the crowd to where Gideon was now talking to Harlan Webb, one hand in his pocket, listening the way he listened to everything, with his whole attention, without impatience. "That sounds right," she said. As the afternoon tipped toward evening and the light came long and gold across the flat ground, Evelyn stepped away from the gathering for a few minutes. Just a few. She walked to the edge of the tree line and stood with her back to the noise and looked out at the direction of the land. Northeast, 4 miles, where the unfinished house and the workshop frame, now becoming a workshop, sat under the spring sky, waiting. She thought about the version of herself 3 years ago, arriving in Red Hollow with $42 and a trunk and a stubbornness she hadn't yet learned to call anything more honest than that. She thought about the long, careful work of building a life and the longer, harder work of deciding to let someone into it. She thought about all the arguments she'd made to herself in the dark, the walls she'd constructed with such careful intention, and the strange fact that what had finally moved them was not a grand gesture or a dramatic moment, but simply the sustained presence of a man who meant what he said, and said what he meant, and showed up day after day, not asking to be let in, but giving her time to decide for herself. She had not been rescued. That was important to understand. She had been met. There was a difference, a significant one, and she had spent enough years understanding the difference to name it correctly. She had been met by someone who recognized what she was and didn't try to make it smaller, and she had met him back. And what they were building was not a compromise between two lives, but an addition. Two things that existed separately, now also existing together, without either one being subtracted. That was the thing she would have told herself, if she could have reached back to the woman with the $42 and the locked-tight heart. Not "it will be fine," because fine was not the point. Not "let your guard down," because your guard is not the problem. But this: there is a difference between protecting what you've built and refusing to build any further. At some point, the walls you made for protection become the walls of a prison, and only you can tell which one you're standing in. She had been standing in one for a long time. She had chosen to step out of it. That had been her choice, made freely, maintained daily, not surrendered under pressure, but arrived at through the patient accumulation of evidence that some things are worth the risk of losing. Footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn to know. Gideon came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "People are wondering where you went," he said. "Let them wonder for another minute." He was quiet, which was comfortable now. She looked out at the northeast sky, where the mountains had gone purple-gray in the changing light. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. "Are you?" "Yeah." He looked back at her, and in his face there was nothing hidden. No performance, no management, no careful control. Just the man himself, tired from a long and significant day, exactly where he'd been heading for longer than he'd known. "Yeah, I am." She reached over and took his arm the way she'd taken his hand in February on the cleared ground, simply, without ceremony. "Come on," she said. "Clara is going to start organizing people if we leave her unattended too long." He laughed, that low, real laugh she'd filed away months ago on a boarding house night that she now had indefinite access to. "Can't have that." They walked back together toward the crowd and the fiddle music and the long table with its too much food, and all the people who had watched them carefully, and then, in the slow way of small towns, come to believe in them. The mountains behind them held the last light of the day on their white peaks for a long time after the valley below fell into evening. They had seen other things built in their shadow, other partnerships, other hard winters, other springs that came around again. They were not sentimental about it, but they were still there, steady and certain as anything in that country, framing the ordinary, extraordinary life being built in the valley below them with the same impartial attention they gave to everything that had the persistence to endure. Some things survive the harshest seasons. Some things, given the right ground and the right conditions, and two people stubborn enough to build them properly, do more than survive. They become the thing that lasts.